All right. Hi, and welcome to the SICSS Festival. The festival is part of SICSS, the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. I'm Matt Salganik, one of the organizers of SICSS. The mission of the Summer Institutes is to provide open, high-quality training in computational social science to researchers around the world. We want to accelerate the growth of the field and ensure that it develops practices that are in the long-term interests of science and society. Each summer since 2017, we have offered 2-week summer training programs for graduate students, postdocs, and junior faculty. The Summer Institutes offer both social scientists and data scientists broadly defined. So far, we've provided this free training for more than 700 participants from around the world. The event that you're attending now is part of the SICSS Festival, which provides a chance for our alumni to host tutorials and participate in discussions of interest to the computational social science community. This event is a panel discussion on taking quantitative description seriously. Our moderator is Kevin Munger. Kevin is assistant professor of political science and social data analytics at Penn State. His research looks at social media and other contemporary internet technologies and how they have changed political communication. One thing I personally love about Kevin's research is that he always moves very, very quickly into all kinds of new platforms and media. And so if you see something in one of Kevin's papers, it may seem fringe at the moment, but often becomes an important venue for political communication. And at the same time that he rushes into all these new platforms, he also thinks very carefully about how these platforms change over time, which is an important topic that's not often deeply considered. I'm also very happy to say that Kevin is an alum of SICSS-Princeton 2019. So as you've heard, this event is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. And now on to the main event. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, Matt. And thanks everyone for being here. We're very excited to get to talk to you about quantitative description. And as a big part of that, the journal that we launched this year, the Journal of Quantitative Description. So digital media, sorry. Brief statistics, I'm going to introduce the co-panelists here. Then we're going to have about, hopefully shooting for about half an hour of conversation on our end. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat. And then for the second half of this discussion, I will go look through the chat, find some questions to bring to everyone's attention, and then we'll talk it over. So yeah, also if you prefer to ask a question out loud, you're welcome to do so as well. But I think the default mode will be looking through the chat. So first up, I want to introduce our panelists here. First, we have Eszter Hargittai, who's a sociologist and in a communication department in University of Zurich. She studies, she got a wealth of research on a number of topics related to digital media, specifically when it comes to how people use these technologies. Yeah, I mean, if you work in this area, you've certainly seen her work. Andy Guess is a assistant professor of politics here at Princeton. He's been doing lots of excellent research using quantitative descriptive methods, even before we were all about this as a method, into how people use social media and the internet to learn about politics and just simply how they use it. And so I think some of his work in this area, specifically related to fake news or general questions about news consumption, have changed the conversation in the public sphere about how people are using these technologies. And Andy and Eszter are the co-editors with me of this new journal. And our final co-panelist, Jen Pan, is Associate Professor of Communication at Stanford University. She's joining us as one of the inaugural authors of our journal. Her paper there is exemplary of her general research in this area, looking at digital communication in China and in other parts of the world beyond simply the US-Europe sphere, which is a big part of what we're trying to advance in this journal as well. A lot of Jen's work has been using both quantitative descriptive and causal research to understand what's going on in the digital media and media space in China and some other authoritarian contexts. So very excited to have this group of people here. And once again, thank you all for joining us. So I want to kick this off by describing a little bit of the motivation that we had for, yeah, thank Eszter. Eszter's correct. It's also on the editorial board at that journal. So thank you for that. So the motivation for thinking about quantitative description. So as Matt mentioned, I've been doing some research on digital media for basically since grad school. And I think as many social scientists working in the computational social science broadly defined space are aware, there's a big interest in understanding causality and getting causality right. And certainly that was my introduction to the field. So when I started doing research on Twitter, I tried to design a boutique Twitter bot experiment. And I think it was helpful and I learned a lot. But in the process of doing that, I came to think about some of the limitations of the current focus on causality. There are simply in these, especially when it comes to digital media, there's so much going on we simply are unaware of. It's very difficult for us to keep up with progress in this field. Our intuitions about what's going on are perhaps not the best. And so if we're asking specific causal questions, there are two main limitations that I want to talk about right now before kicking it off to the rest of the panel. First is the idea that causal knowledge is really, really expensive, right? And so as we're learning more and more about how difficult it is to do credible causal research, something that I think a lot of people come to appreciate is that it's just really hard. The amount of resources you have to invest to answer a very small question well is large. And so if we think about the total amount of research topics that we would like to know about, even in a field that constrained digital media, let's say, and we think about the aggregate amount of knowledge that is being produced using these expensive causal methods, it seems somewhat incommensurate, right? So it's difficult for us to cover as much as we would want to cover, given the pace of scientific knowledge production and the cost, increasingly requiring large teams of people to do this kind of research well. So one of the big advantages for quantitative description as a method is that it scales very well. So for a lot of these digital media platforms, we are able to get the universe, or at least a very large subsample, potentially a completely random subsample, which allows us to know something credible about this entire platform. And another of my major concerns is about the way these platforms change over time. And so simply establishing a baseline and a pipeline to collect large amounts of data over time, as the world changes, as new technologies are introduced, as the platforms change, as the user base changes, as whatever, a pandemic happens, we would like to be able to have this baseline of data from which to work. And if we're just answering causal questions in the short run, we don't really have access to that. So quantitative description kind of. The second major issue with the current focus on causality is we've had a kind of credibility revolution in the social sciences. So we are doing good causal research now. It seems a lot of people are circulating around the fact that the next big crisis is about generalizability or external validity. So causal research is very good at generating local knowledge. But generally, what we want as social scientists is non-local knowledge. We'd like to be able to take that knowledge and apply it to a different context. And to do that, we need to have knowledge of this other context. And so in order to transport knowledge from one place to another, from one time to another, from one platform, from any kind of what do you think of as a context, we need rich descriptive data about the two contexts that are being compared. And hopefully there are many more contexts than that. So even if you are focused on causality, I think we're trying to make the argument that quantitative description is a complement to that research and should make it more applicable in more places. So that is a brief read of our manifesto for motivating quantitative description. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's been working in this area, for a while now, and your motivations for doing so and what you think is valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think I share a lot of those same motivations. I would say, though, for me, the core motivation for doing quantitative description work starts from the fact that we have a lot of assumptions about how the world works, what motivates political behavior, what causes socially salient outcomes. But many of these assumptions are not at all based in empirical facts. We assume something is true, but it's not been empirically, systematically assessed. And as a result, everything built on top of them, it could be super elegant theoretical models, it could be ingenious experimental designs, they end up being wrong because the starting point is wrong. And so that's maybe why some results are not generalizable. And I would say in terms of the kind of substantive impact, it's for science, that's a big problem. But we also see really tangible outcomes where then these results that are really not based on a solid foundation become the basis of policymaking. And so kind of that is really the core of why I've been motivated to do quantitative description. I think we need to have just more knowledge about empirical facts of what is before we can really try to explain why something happens, how it happens, and the so what of it.
Yeah, I think Andy's work in this area as well has been about the fake news conversation, right? There's been all this, assumptions about how it works, and he just looks at it and says, well, actually, why don't we study this? Why don't we want to know how it works? Right? So I think that's exactly right. So I'm going to now transition to talk about the journal itself and the motivation for it. And I'll just read one quote from our manifesto here. So we hope that when we are talking about quantitative description, we are raising the status of this as a method. We think that in some sense, all research has to be causal is not a good situation. But so in our manifesto, which you can find on the manifesto in quotes here, on our journal website, it's the first article published. We talk about how critique alone does not change the material conditions and incentives for practicing academics. We see this journal as a practical step towards raising the status of description as a method. So these days, lots of academics complain about certain elements of the what's going on in publishing or research, whatever. We think that practical steps, building institutions like SICSS, is necessary for that. And so I'll turn it over to Eszter for her to explain her thoughts.
Great, thank you. So I thought I'd go back a little bit to explain where this came about practically, the journal, and how something like this comes about across people from different fields. So while I do have an official affiliation with the political science department at Zurich, that's mostly because it's a great department, a lot of my work is actually not about politics at all. So I want to make sure, even though my co-panelists here are political scientists, that people understand that we do way beyond that. And so how would we even come together? So what Kevin didn't mention is that a lot of my research is about skills, internet skills, digital literacy. And so he and Andy have been doing some work in that domain. And then the three of us connected because of that general interest. And then we finally met in person at a conference and really didn't know each other that well, frankly. But there was a little bit, I mean, we'd met and I really liked their work in this domain. And so Kevin has a mailing list. And last August, he puts out all sorts of thoughts that are big thoughts and interesting thoughts, and I responded to this one that he put out about data related issues, basically. And I mentioned to him that this was early August, and that this really resonated with me from a somewhat different perspective, which is that over the years I've been very frustrated by the fact that often you'll have some really interesting data, and then you're stuck having to write an 8,000 piece paper around one interesting finding, because most journals won't take you seriously with anything shorter. And any of you who have tried to publish something shorter will know this, because even now, I mean, I have a paper in R&R where we have this amazing data set, panel data, 4 years across a decade about a change in internet use, same people followed. And one of the main comments we got from the reviewers, not at JQD, was that, well, the literature review is kind of thin. like, okay, how many more papers of the about 100 papers I've published about digital inequality would you like me to write up the literature review of digital inequality? But sure, I'll do it one more time. Okay. But so that was partly our motivation here, is also that there needs to be a venue where the focus, that if you have some interesting findings about description, don't bend over backwards and contort yourself in all sorts of ways to make it fit into a traditionally looking paper. That's really not, shouldn't have to be necessary. And so that was my angle on this. And I wrote to Kevin, and he really responded. And then he said, yes, I have been thinking about the idea of a journal of quantitative description or something along those lines. And at that point, it sounded like it could be anything. And I said, okay, well, that's great. Anything is probably a little too much, a little overwhelming, and I don't think you're gonna really, I don't think that's practically gonna happen. So why don't we do digital media? That actually took us a while to come down to the DM part. We played around with different possible ways to narrow it, but this worked. And I will say on that note that we do want to emphasize that when we say digital media, we don't just mean that the data come from digital media, right? Like the questions have to do with digital media as well, because frankly, nowadays, so much comes through digital media that at that point, it could be anything. So okay, I'm not talking about process yet. So I think I'll stop there right now and hand it over to Andy, and I'll come back to some of these points when we talk process.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess what I'd like to, there are a few things I'd like to touch on, but maybe just to give a little sense of some other frustrations that we have with the sort of publication process and the extent to which it sort of undervalues descriptive work. So just drawing on my own experience, as Kevin mentioned, like I do find myself doing a lot of what we now are calling quantitative description work. And I guess I've had mixed success in sort of finding sort of outlets within my field that sort of were willing to consider these like questions worth publishing about, and like questions worth devoting journal space to. And part of that is just sort of our kind of subjective notions, which are bound by our disciplines of like what's an important question. And sometimes my response and response of other scholars has been to like sort of go around your disciplinary journals and find other venues and outlets where descriptive research might be more welcome. In some sense, that's what JQD, that's like what we're all about. Like we're explicitly interdisciplinary. But on the other hand, we hope that there's sort of a feedback loop that's going to be involved as well, where we can sort of show that if you like explicitly value descriptive work, you think that these questions are worth devoting time and energy to, then you can actually shed light on important concerns for your own fields, and that can change people's perceptions of what are interesting questions to spend time on. So I guess part of my hope is just that we're showing people that like you can come up with interesting findings that have direct relevance to longstanding theoretical concerns within your own home discipline, and that can hopefully improve the situation from the perspective of people who do descriptive work within various disciplines. I'm speaking as a political scientist, but I think that the same goes for people who come from disciplinary homes of sociology or communication, economics or whatever field that you may sort of find a home in. So that's sort of some 2 cents there, and I'm happy to sort of talk more about other related topics further in the discussion.
Fantastic. We wanted to also mention that in terms of the scope of the journal, we're talking a lot about interdisciplinarity here, and one component of that is methodological interdisciplinarity. So we're trying to have basically a 50-50 split between digital trace data, so the kind of thing Andy's been doing mostly, which is scraping browser histories, or what I've been doing, which is describing trends in YouTube viewership over time. So half of it is that kind of data, and half of it is survey data, which we think is also very necessary for understanding digital media. So thinking about the individual users as citizens as the unit of analysis, which is what most of Eszter's work focuses on. But I think all of us do kind of a mixture of these when the time comes. So yeah, talking a bit more about the process of the JQD, I turn it back over to Eszter so she can describe a bit more on nuts and bolts what it's like with our journal.
Yes. So I'll describe this partly as we are hoping that many of you, all of you listening in today are potential authors for articles that you'll submit to the journal, but also as potential reviewers. So the way the process works, it's very different from most journals. And we think it's worked well, and I'll be curious to hear Jen's perspective as someone who isn't among the editors who submitted. So we are working with a letter of inquiry model, and on our website, I think it's pretty simple. It's journalqd.org/LOI. And when you go there, there's information about what we ask in a letter of inquiry, and it's basically up to 500 words, so fairly brief. And we have some very concrete questions we ask you to answer, having to do with, what's your question, motivation, what's the data source, method, and we take that information and review that ourselves, and if needed, discuss amongst us. Actually, I think we usually discuss it, most of them, and decide whether that looks like a fit for the journal. And we usually end up looking at things like, well, these people are using causal language. That's not a fit because we really do not publish causal claims. Or, so there are basic things where we might decide, or it's not actually digital media. So those are usually reasons why we will just tell the authors that this is not a fit. In some cases, we might just ask for clarification, where it may be that it's a fit, but it's not quite clear yet. So we might actually, there is the possibility of an R&R on an LOI, actually. But the point is that if we say, yes, this works, then the authors write up the paper, submit it, and then we send it out for review. And at that point, it's not, what we're asking the reviewers is not to say whether it's a fit for the journal, and not really to say, is there a comprehensive literature review? I mean, obviously, we want the authors to review some relevant work and be in conversation with others doing similar work. But that's not the focus. We are basically asking reviewers to make sure that the methodology is sound, that it's written up in a clear way, that people can follow along, and that it's transparent. And that's what we're asking. And so it's rare. In fact, I'm not sure we've had a case where we sent something out for review and it just got rejected. At that point, usually it goes to R&R, and we ask for revisions. And there it might not work out. So I'm not saying we accept everything at that point. That's certainly not the case. But I would say once you've made it through the LOI stage, you do have better chances, and we're really there to work with you to get it to a point where it can be published. So we're not rejecting papers because, it's not really a fit. Also with online publications, we don't have space constraints the way some journals still, I would say, rather artificially do have space constraints. So we don't have some quota that we're trying to fit. We're not, we want to reject X number because then we're gonna be the real journal that rejects so many papers. That's not our point. We want to work with authors to publish good papers that fit our what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's great, Eszter. And now, Jen, did you have tell us what the process was like from your end?
Yeah, so it was definitely the fastest publication process I've ever had. Obviously faster than the disciplinary journals, which we know are really slow, but also actually faster than Science, which is the only general interest journal I've had experience with. So I submitted 2 LOIs. Both were projects for which we had the data. We thought we'd learn something kind of new that would potentially challenge existing assumptions and views, but we hadn't written papers for either one, and we hadn't kind of finished the analysis for either one. One of the LOIs was accepted, the other one was not, and that was super helpful because the LOIs only took me like 15-20 minutes to write because they're very specific about what they want. So I don't need to be writing like 3-page things. So I kept it short. It didn't take a lot of time, and we were able to direct our resources to the one that was accepted. And so the important part is that I didn't spend like months doing the analysis, writing up a 30-page paper for the rejected one, because then it would have been rejected after all that time and effort. So that saved a ton of time. It was really great. Then we got 2 really good reviews in a short time period. I want to say like 6 weeks or something. And it was during COVID, so all journal timelines slowed down, but we got the reviews back really quickly. And once the article was accepted, it was published like almost immediately. And I feel like for me, that's just so, obviously because it's open access and online, that's what happens. But I'm so used to journals having like a year-long or like 2-year-long gap between when the paper is accepted and when it actually comes out. So I was like, oh my gosh, we did this paper and it's already available. And so I felt like it was a very enjoyable review experience. If you can describe review experience as that for me.
That's great.
Yeah.
Can I just add something actually? And thanks, Jen. It's really wonderful to hear that you've had such a positive experience. And thanks for describing both that you had submitted to. And actually, that is part of the reason that we are doing this model, because we recognize that the kind of paper you might write for JQD is not something that you can necessarily easily then send to another journal, precisely because of this niche here. And so we want to make sure people aren't spending months writing something that might not work for us anyway. So I'm really glad that worked so well there.
Andy, do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question to Jen. I was curious if you could say a little more about sort of how the process from data collection to the writing of the LOIs. So did you, when you decided to collect this data, was it for a specific research question or paper that you had in mind? Like, was it for a larger project that you're still working on? Was it specifically for the research questions that you ended up writing up for JQD? Would you have collected this data anyway? I'm just sort of curious about how you planned the data collection and what you had in mind when you were doing it.
Yeah, so for the accepted LOI, these are actually data sets that we didn't collect, others had collected them, and we were augmenting. And I think I'm of the orientation that when there's interesting data, whether existing or that we could collect, I'm like, let's get the data. So I actually have a lot of data sets that are collected or in progress. Sometimes we do exploratory analysis, and depending on how it looks, we might pursue a project, or we might go further down the road with analyzing that data set and keep on collecting it. And other times we kind of abandon the effort. And so I would say with my experience of the accepted LOI, we had already started looking into those data sets, and it was looking there, we were getting some interesting results, but having the LOI accepted, I think pushed us to say, okay, we can do a descriptive paper, and we're going to do it. And we really focused on how can we best analyze this data? Because I think if we hadn't gotten the LOI accepted, I think we would have then thought, okay, what kind of less descriptive paper could we write? And could we use this data set in such a way, maybe this is the contortion that Eszter was talking about, to write a paper that would be accepted at a top 3 or top journal. So I think it was that point where we had the data, we were starting to get into it, and knowing the fact that we could write a descriptive piece really allowed us to then kind of do a project, which I think ultimately we learned a lot from, because it really challenged some prevailing understandings of what happens in social media in China. So the paper that I accepted is looking at public sentiment in Chinese social media as COVID was first emerging. And I think the prevailing kind of thought is that in an authoritarian regime, you have something bad happen, there's going to be, this is where you look for critical public sentiment. And the thing is, we find that, but we also find simultaneously a groundswell of support for the government. And that kind of support on social media is something that people haven't looked for in the past, but which I think from survey-based research, we got hints of. And so this is showing that with digital trace data, we actually find this kind of simultaneous divide in authoritarian context when you have a kind of crisis event. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I think that I've told this to Andy. Like, I don't think we would have written this paper if we hadn't had the Journal of Quantitative Description venue. It would have been contorted into something else.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's definitely the kind of outcome we would like. Is that part of the motivation is we feel like so many people are sitting on amazing data sets, right? And it's like everyone just wants this data. The marginal cost in some sense is low, and so we'll go ahead and say if anyone has any questions here, please type them in the chat. We'll keep chatting as well. There's a couple questions already, yeah. So right, yeah, we're hoping that the marginal cost for a lot of these papers is low. So to Douglas Perry's question, it could go either way. So I believe we've had some LOIs where the authors have not collected the data yet. And that is helpful to note because a big part of the LOI process is describing the sampling frame, either in terms of a survey, how you're going to get the sample for the survey respondents, or in terms of how you're going to sample for the digital trace data. So we've had some situations like that. And I mean, we generally ask for, after an LOI is accepted, to have the paper submitted within 2 months. But it's not strict. I mean, if you had a reason to say, 3 or 4 months, I think we could work with you on that. At the same time, I guess I think a lot of them, I would say the majority, are situations like the one Jen is describing, where people have data sets, they're sitting on them, they want to do something with them, they don't want to come up with some contorted causal story, and so we're there to scoop up a lot of really high quality data analysis that otherwise just wouldn't get done. Yeah. Eszter?
Yeah, so there was a question about whether there's a review for an LOI, and Andy has responded. I just wanted to expand a little bit. So there's not a formal review in the sense that we don't send out LOIs. So the three of us discuss them, and then we will respond. But we do give feedback, right? So if it all looks good, we probably don't give a ton of feedback because it all looks good, and we just say yes, please submit. If we see issues, then we will certainly explain why. So we'll say you're making causal statements, or whatever it might be, this isn't digital media. We will explain that. One more thing we haven't touched upon in terms of process that I wanted to mention is that, I mean, part of the reason we're doing this LOI model, it's not, I mean, yes, partly it's everything we've described, but also because there's just, obviously there's limited reviewer resources out there, and we are all, I'm sure, overwhelmed by the requests we get, and we don't want to pile on too much. And with this model, we feel that we can be just much better about using those resources, because reviewers we're not sending out things that are not a match, right? Like I mean, don't you hate it when you wait 4 months to have the journal tell you, well, this is not a fit for our journal, and 3 people have spent time reviewing it? It's a horribly inefficient use, not just of time, but of our very precious reviewer resources. So that's part of our point with this process.
Yeah, just a few other things about the journal itself, the process. In so many ways, it feels like the bar is just so low. Like the baseline for academic publishing is so frustrating along the dimensions that Eszter was just describing. Another dimension that we kind of came naturally to us is that it's completely open access and there are zero article processing charges. So it is what's sometimes called diamond standard open access. And it's just, I guess it's just baffling that anything is not like that. But again, that comes back to the need to actually build these institutions and to take critique, like people have been saying, well, the academic publishing process is predatory and inefficient, and many, I mean, I think this is a kind of universally accepted at this point, but it's not going to change unless people start building up other institutions. And so certainly founding the journal is part of that, but the other part of it is getting people involved in the process, submitting LOIs, and helping us review. And I think thus far we've been very happy with basically the percentage of reviewers who accept our request, which is, there's just a trust that's broken down between editors and reviewers in a lot of these major like the top outlets. Editors have to ask 10 people to get 3 reviews, and then the reviewers are burned out and jaded because they're wasting their time, because then ultimately the paper gets rejected for some reason that they think is ridiculous. And so really trying to break down that process is hopefully going to be, just respecting everyone a bit more, and kind of building a virtuous cycle of trust, which will transcend a lot of the sclerotic pathologies of traditional journal publishing.
I mean, half my frustrations actually from reviewing are that why am I even reviewing this? This should have been desk rejected, right? So there's that other end of it, right? That it should never have gone out to take up 3 people's time. And so we are addressing that as well. I mean, that may be harsh, but it's the reality. Sorry.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, Andy?
I mean, I think, yeah, all of what Kevin and Eszter are saying sort of implies like more of a role at the editorial stage, right? And I mean, which is admittedly easier said than done. But I think we all have kind of frustrations as authors of getting sort of vague or even contradictory advice from reviewers and sort of editors that don't give that kind of guidance that you often wish that you got. And so, one thing that we would like to be doing, and like we're trying hard to do, is to provide clear guidance, especially in cases where we think that some reviewer comments are more critical than others, or when things aren't clear, to sort of give a clear signal to authors that this is the thing that you should worry about or focus on. And hopefully that also just like clears up confusion and streamlines the whole process. But that does mean there's just more room for discretion and just like more kind of editorial processes that go on both before and after a manuscript is out to review.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely much more hands-on than some editors. So in communication, very few editors ever send you anything beyond here are the reviews, deal with it, which is very frustrating, frankly. So we definitely write an intro to it, and we'll say things like, we're less concerned than reviewer A about point X, but we do think point Y is really important to address, and so the author should take that seriously.
Yeah, yes, on all this.
I will say, sorry, Kevin, to interrupt. There was one point I knew I was losing. So part of the reason we're able to make this work, I mean, I will say this just to be realistic, is we are volunteering our time. So many editors do get compensated, and we're not, obviously, because we have no budget. I should also add, in terms of process, we are asking authors to work with us on layout, but we have done the work to create templates, both tech and doc versions that authors can use. So it's been a pretty seamless process, frankly. But that is partly why we're able to make it work. So I don't want to make it seem like a journal doesn't cost anything. Also, we're very fortunate that the University of Zurich main library hosts the journal and takes on the cost of hosting open access journals. And so we have staff there that we don't pay for. So that's been tremendous. So there are definitely costs. It's not like you can just run off. And I mean, we may have been a little naive back in August last year. Let's start a journal, typical famous last words, but it has worked out really well. So I'm excited, but I do want to be transparent about that. It's not like you can not entirely wake up one day and just start a journal, even though it seems like that's what we did, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of starting it was getting a lot of buy-in from the editorial board, the advisory board. We had a lot of people help with this. We got some great RAs. And again, yes, thanks to the University of Zurich for just funding basic open science initiatives. Just putting these resources in the public sphere makes it so much less annoying than having to go through university bureaucracies to get funding, and then all that is very unpleasant. So I think we've touched on the process a bit here, and we've got a couple questions related to the scope of the journal. I guess there's one more question here about, yes, all right, so there's about the scope here. So let's ask about, there's people asking about the scope, both in terms of what is quantitative description versus causality, and what is digital media. And so that really touches on the major questions of scope. So I guess, well, let's start with the question of digital media first. Eszter, you talked about this briefly already, but if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I can, and then please do as well. So it's where and I may be more narrow, so I definitely would like you to expand on it too. But so it's where the substantive question has something to do with digital media, right? So whether that's about how people use digital media, or that's about how content on digital media manifests itself. But it can't just be. Here's what it can't just be. It can't just be, we downloaded the press releases of a bunch of organizations from their Twitter accounts. Okay, because that is there, it's just a press release. Now, if you tell us that you downloaded the press releases from their Twitter accounts and have data about how the public interacts with those press releases through their tweets, retweets, responses, whatnot, then there might be something, because then there's something about the digital media interactive nature that's happening. But if you're just grabbing the content that has about pretty much anything just because it's online, that in and of itself is not digital media. So there's one example.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to just sort of make the call ourselves, and that the editorial discretion means so we're just making the call, the three of us. But B, because it's an LOI, we really hope that if we say, actually, this isn't a good fit, no one's feelings are hurt, right? So just you're not invested a bunch at that stage. And so I guess we just appeal to the fact that we're calling the shots on this. And there's going to be some edge cases, and it could go either way. But so I think that's that. I think we should talk about causality and description a bit. This is like we've got a couple questions here. So if any of y'all want to jump in, Jen, I know you were talking a little bit about this earlier, but certainly it's a hot topic in comm and political science and sociology and all of our disciplines.
On the question of, so just the last question, I think it depends on what you mean by theory. I think depends on discipline. If you're coming from political economy, I don't know if Andre is coming from political economy, and so theoretically parsimonious can mean a particular thing. But actually, I think that you can do description that then informs theory or challenges prevailing theories. One of my first papers looks at Chinese government censorship, and there we're saying, everyone thought censorship was about suppressing critical content targeted toward the regime. But in fact, what we find is that criticisms is fine, but it's about suppressing any social mobilization. And I think that is that a theory or not? Some people might, I've seen people describe that as a theory. I don't know if we said it was a theory, but I think regardless, that empirical basis then has gone on to inform, I think, game theoretic and other theoretical kind of mathematical theoretical models. So I don't know that we necessarily need to say you have a description, it's not theory. I think it depends on particular context. Also on causality. So it's interesting, the LOI that was rejected for us, I think the editors told us it was too causal. And what it was about was looking at, well, actually it had the word effect. So it was looking at bans on TikTok, bans of WeChat and TikTok, or threats of banning social media platforms. What does it do? And we said we were going to describe like the reaction afterwards. But then the feedback we got back was like, this seems to be causal. You're looking at the effect of a ban or threats of ban on behavior. And when we got that feedback, we're like, well, we thought we were doing description. But then I think looking back now in time, I do see that as a causal question. And so I think to the earlier question of like, you know, social scientists like to use language that suggests there exists some causal relationship when we can't commit to a causal framework. I would say quantitative description is not any of that. It is about description. It's not about when you can't measure a causal effect and saying that it's instead description.
It's actually been absolutely fascinating to watch how hard it is for people to get rid of that language, even when they are, in fact, not making a causal argument. It's true. It is so ingrained in us social scientists to say effect, causes, results in. We have thought about, I see we haven't updated the website, but we have actually thought about, and I think we will add to the LOI page, note about if you're using the following words, your project is probably causal. So think about it.
Yeah, just adding on that, I think we've all we've come to learn, like I said, of sort of trigger words that we think is sort of indicative that there could be a causal argument lurking under the surface. And I think that's like useful for us as editors. It's useful for authors interested in like thinking through their LOIs and what they're really pitching. But at the same time, it's not totally dispositive in the sense that like we are also sort of trained, as Eszter said, we're trained to use these words even when they're not appropriate. And so while they might be a good indicator, it doesn't necessarily mean that the argument is causal. And so it also means just like being careful about language and sometimes it's a totally valid, like within scope question. People are just dressing it up with words like drives or consequence or impact. And it's like a habit that I think we have to sort of unlearn. And just one other kind of point is that I think we're just realizing that there is a sort of gray area. It's not like there is a set of questions that are causal, a set of questions that are not causal, and sort of everyone can agree on which is which. In fact, there seems to be an area for kind of discussion and debate about whether questions fall on one side or another, or even kind of difficult to classify. And so that's sort of an ongoing learning experience for all of us, I think.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And I think, so we've gotten some pushback along the lines that Andre was talking about here from people who are more like even on the philosophy of science side. And fair enough. I think a case can be made that even the act of perception is causal. Like the way that my brain translates these, sensory inputs into what I see is based on a causal model in my brain. So we're not going to solve these philosophy of science questions here, which is ultimately why editorial discretion is helpful, because basically we call the shots, and if it's in the journal, then it's quantitative description, let's say. So I think that is ultimately what's going on. But the question will evolve, and I think specifically as people get used to making like a full-throated descriptive paper, we're going to start getting better, we're going to start teaching people how to do quantitative description. We're going to start reading papers that do it. And so just as there is now a very robust sort of sociological situation for producing causal research, we think that like making a feedback loop for quantitative description will clarify a lot of these questions in the act of just going through this process. Yeah. Eszter?
I just wanted to underscore what Andy said. So it's not like It's not like we put the LOI through some AI that spits out like, oh, no, this sounds causal. No, we read it for what it is, and then we would write back and say, this sounds good, but be careful because right now you're using causal language.
And I would just say that as a kind of author, you look at the website and you're like, really? They just want us to answer these questions? Maybe I should write more. I think to everyone here who's considering, don't do that. And even me, it's like they gave an example. It was really short. I was like, can I really write such a short thing? Is that okay? But and so I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do it because they said I'm gonna take them at their word at their word. And so I would just suggest that anyone here who's thinking about submitting, don't like overthink it. Just answer those questions. Like, don't put in any extraneous things. Save yourself the time and effort. You'll get feedback quickly about whether it's right or not.
Exactly right. I think at this point, our average turnaround time on LOIs is about a week. So that's just yeah, and then there's some maybe an R&R sometimes, but yeah, overall that's what we're looking for. So we've got about 8 minutes left. I think there's one other topic that I think could bring us to the end here, which is this question from Sebastian Derry, which is about digital media and saying, so where should we be looking? I think a lot of people in the audience would like to know, like, wait, what should I study? What's an interesting topic here? I would just want to kick it off and say, I think definitely looking at things like Twitch and TikTok, for example, things that are not being studied yet. And this is where, ironically, it's perhaps younger people who are more in tune with trends in digital media are able to, know what's going on in a way that maybe, some other folks are not. So that's great. But the one other thing I want to emphasize is say we should be looking outside the U.S. and Europe. So certainly in our inaugural issue, we've got 44% of the articles include non-U.S. data, 28% include non-U.S. And non-European data, and we want to get those numbers up. So basically, the whole world is using digital media now, and in a lot of places, they have. There have been hundreds of papers written about Twitter use in thousands, millions in the U.S., right? And yet, in terms of, I was trying to find out what percentage of people use WhatsApp in Mexico and Colombia, and there's basically there's not a paper, there's not a Pew data report, there's nothing that will answer that question, and so that's where I really want to push people to look. For Kieran, as just it could be the U.S. plus other ones is what that figure means. Yeah, so if anyone else wants to add on that point.
I was going to say the same thing. Outside of the U.S., prominent examples include like what happened with Facebook in Myanmar. Like, did it have a like what was going on? And people have done qualitative interviews, but the data is there to do quantitative analysis. I think one of the challenges there is that there's no good machine learning NLP tools for dealing with Burmese and the characteristics of Burmese. But that's workable. Like, someone could take what NLP tools based on Hindi and adapt them and modify them for Burmese. But I think there are a lot of examples where around the world, digital media is deeply consequential to political, social, economic outcomes. We don't really know anything about what's going on. So I think the more people who can work on kind of outside of the US, outside of Europe topics, it really would be beneficial to the state of research.
Yeah, so I think that's a clear case, and I mean, this is good reasons to try to collaborate with people in different contexts. Because certainly, like I don't know, I'm not a domain expert in what's going on in WhatsApp use in Latin America, but that's where collaboration and co-authorship comes in. So that's going to be a very fruitful project, I think. I guess in terms of specific platforms, because that was sort of what was asked, I do think. TikTok, you can get data from TikTok. It's quite exciting and kind of fun, I think. And I think basically the platforms that academics don't use are where to look, right? So our intuitions about what digital media is based on how we use digital media. And academics overwhelmingly use Twitter. Most of us use Facebook to some extent. But I mean, video-based platforms, for example. I have done research on YouTube. I think that's people are starting to study YouTube, but I think still compared to how many hours are spent consuming YouTube, we don't have enough research on that. WhatsApp is hard to study. Let's say a lot of these encrypted platforms are difficult to get data, but I think it's important to do so if we can figure out a good format for getting that data. And then I think streaming chat, Twitch is mentioned. I think that is also a very big area of terms of just how many hours. That's kind of a good baseline, I think. So a big question that we have when we're evaluating these LOIs is like, is this important enough, right? And that's something that every journal is going to have to decide. So on the one hand, the nice thing with the LOA process is that we are making that decision, the reviewers are not, right? So we are just saying, is this important enough or not? And if we send it out for review, we think it is important enough. Still, we have to make some kind of subjective call. And so one way, I think, to motivate the fact that this is important enough is simply to say how many human hours are spent in this area of action. And so something like so many people watch so many hours of Twitch is a good reason to study it. Even if, let's say, coming from a political science perspective, a traditional journal would say, well, what is the impact of Twitch on elections, right? And that's begging the question, right? If we have to demonstrate that in order to study this platform, we're never going to be able to actually know that. So I think we're trying to get in at that earlier stage. So anyone else want to comments on where's your next project? I guess we can maybe end up there. What is your next project in digital media, Andy, Eszter, and Jen?
I guess, I mean, one thing I would add, so plus one on everything Kevin said, one thing I would add is just there's also not a lot of research on just combining platforms. So like trying to understand, how behavior in one platform is related to behavior in another platform, or like how being on multiple platforms, how that matters for research questions, like whether it's common that people use like Twitter and Facebook, or like YouTube and TikTok, and whether they serve different purposes, and like how common this kind of use is. So like second streaming is sort of like a hybrid media like version of this kind of question, right? So I think like cross-platform research is really interesting as well. And I guess I would just add that like don't overlook just like old school platforms that have been around a long time. So like I don't see a lot of research on LinkedIn, for example, but like tons of people use it. It's not like cutting edge or like interesting to a lot of people, but I think there's like a lot of like very relevant consequential stuff that happens there, like hiring. And so we often tend to overlook these kinds of like, I don't know, seemingly boring platforms, but that like lots of people use.
Yeah, on that point, actually, so I want to give a shout out to Pinterest, which, again, probably not for politics, but who knows, because no one studies this, so we don't know. But Pinterest is actually way more popular than Twitter. Like the little data we have, we know it is. It's overwhelmingly female. I would like to think that's not why people are ignoring it, because that would just be really upsetting. But there, it's just people spend a lot of time there, and we know very little. I supervised a master's thesis, and this person is now my doctoral student, so we should have some work coming out. But it's really important to be where the people are and not just where we are or where the data might come easier. And I do agree with Andy. I mean, the little we know about use of different platforms by the same people, we actually know that they use them pretty differently. So it's very important to have data across platforms.
Jen, you want the last word on this?
I don't know if I can do that. So one project I'm doing is looking at TikTok in China. So ByteDance owns TikTok globally, and then it's branded as Douyin in China. So we're gathering a lot of Douyin data. And so then we'll have WeChat, Weibo, and Douyin. And so those are the big three in China, and we're trying to then see what we can do with that. I also saw there was a question on working with the platforms themselves. One thing just quickly, as a junior person, so grad student, even pre-tenure, I would just be cautious about having those conversations with the platforms. You're going to get into not just IRB issues, but like IP, industrial contracts, and it might drag on for a long time. Or you're in the companies, you're analyzing data, but then you can't use it for publication. So I would just be super cautious if you're earlier in your career about having conversations and trying to collaborate with the platforms.
Well, yeah, thanks. And Matt, to send this off.
Yeah, I just hope we can all join in thanking Kevin for organizing and moderating, and thanking Jen, Eszter, and Andy for sharing all their insights. It's a really exciting project, this new journal, and I think it was wonderful how we got to hear about the journal leading to new intellectual questions, what those questions might be, how this can open up a new space for different kinds of research that seems really, really important. So thank you all so much. Let's stop the recording now.